The morning I found the email, I was just trying to look up a cornbread recipe. That sounds so ordinary, I know. But that's the thing about the moments that change your life. They don't announce themselves. They don't come with warning signs or dramatic music. They come on a Tuesday, when you're sitting at the kitchen table in your robe, holding a cup of coffee that's already gone cold, and your son's tablet is right there because he forgot it when he rushed out the door. I'm 68 years old. I raised 2 children in a house on Birchfield Lane in a small town outside of Columbus, Ohio. I worked 31 years as a school librarian. I buried my husband, Gordon. No, I can't use that name. My husband. I buried my husband 4 years ago, and when I did, I thought the hardest thing I would ever survive was already behind me. I was wrong. My son moved back home about 18 months after the funeral. He said it made sense. The house was too big for just me, and he and his wife had been renting an apartment across town that cost more than it was worth. I told myself it was practical. I told myself it was what families do. And in those early months, it almost felt that way. His wife was pleasant enough at first. She remembered to say thank you. She helped clear the table without being asked. She called me by my first name, Cecily, which was what I'd asked. And there was a warmth in it, or something I mistook for warmth. I wanted so badly for it to be real. What I didn't notice, because I wasn't looking, was how slowly everything began to shift. It started with small things. She started doing the grocery shopping, which she said was to help me. Then she started picking the groceries, which meant the things I'd eaten my whole life, the brands I knew, the foods that felt like mine, quietly disappeared. My coffee changed. My bread changed. When I mentioned it, she said she was trying to get us all eating healthier, and she said it with such a reasonable smile that I felt embarrassed for bringing it up. Then she started answering my phone when it rang and I was in another room. Just to help, she said. Then she'd forget to mention the calls at all. My sister in Dayton left 2 messages I never knew about until she called my neighbor directly, wondering if something had happened to me. I told myself I was being sensitive. I told myself this was what it meant to share a home with younger people, that you had to give a little, that I was being set in my ways. I had a whole list of reasons I kept telling myself. My son was working long hours at that point, or so he said. He left before I was up most mornings and came home quiet, distracted. When I tried to talk to him about things that were bothering me, he'd say, "Mom, I'm exhausted. Can we do this another time?" And somehow another time never came. That's the thing I keep coming back to, even now. He wasn't unkind. He wasn't cruel. He was just absent. Physically present in my house and completely absent in every way that mattered. 8 months after they moved in, she brought up the finances. It was a Sunday afternoon. My son was there, which I think was intentional. I've wondered about that since. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table, with a legal pad and a very organized look on her face, and she said that she'd been thinking about how to make things easier for me. She said that managing accounts and bills could be so stressful for someone my age. She said it just like that, someone my age. And that, since they were living here now and helping with the house, it would be so much simpler if I added their names to my accounts, just to streamline things. I remember looking at my son. He was looking at the table. I told her I'd think about it. She brought it up again 2 weeks later, and twice more after that. The third time I finally said yes. I've asked myself 1,000 times since why I did that. I think the truth is that I was tired. I was tired of the tension that lived in the house every time I said no to her. I was tired of the way my son went quiet and distant for days after I pushed back on anything. I was tired of feeling like a guest in my own home, and I think some part of me still wanted to believe we were a family making things work. I added their names to my checking account. I told myself it would be fine. That was my first mistake. Gordon, my husband, had a life insurance policy. We'd had it for 30 years. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. The plan had always been that it would cover my living expenses in retirement, maybe eventually help with care if I needed it. After he died, I put it in a dedicated savings account, and I tried not to touch it. It felt like the last thing he'd given me. She knew about it. I don't know exactly when he told her, or how much he'd said, but she knew. The February before I found the email, she sat me down and told me that she'd spoken to a financial advisor, someone she described as very knowledgeable, a friend of a friend, and that based on my situation, it might be time to consolidate my accounts. That having the savings separate was actually less efficient, that there were tax advantages to restructuring things. I didn't understand most of what she said, which I now believe was partly the point. She had paperwork. It looked official. I asked if I could have my own attorney look at it. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. She said, of course, absolutely, there was no rush at all. But the next 2 weeks in that house were the coldest I'd experienced since we'd all been living there. My son barely spoke to me. Dinners were silent. She was perfectly polite, in the way that people are perfectly polite when they want you to feel how displeased they are. I signed the paperwork. I still can't explain that fully. I was 68 years old, and I had stood in front of classrooms of children my entire career. And I was not a timid person. I was not. But there is something that happens to you inside your own home, in the quiet accumulation of 100 small moments where you've been made to feel unreasonable, intrusive, too old, too slow, too difficult. Something breaks down. You stop trusting your own instincts. You start apologizing for things that don't warrant apology. She had understood that. I think she'd planned on it. The Tuesday I found the email, she had driven my son to a work thing. His car was in the shop. She left the tablet on the kitchen counter. I don't think she forgot it. I've turned that detail over many times and I don't think she forgot it. But I also think she didn't expect me to pick it up. I picked it up to look for a recipe. A cornbread recipe, because I was making soup and I wanted cornbread. His email was already open on the screen. I wasn't snooping. I want to be very clear about that. Not for judgment, but because it matters to how I understand what happened next. I was going to close it and open the browser, but the subject line at the top of the screen stopped me cold. It said, "Transfer confirmed. Beaumont account, $47,000. My maiden name is Beaumont." I stood in my kitchen for what felt like a very long time. The soup was simmering on the stove. The winter light came in flat through the window above the sink. I sat down and I read the email. It was from a bank I didn't recognize, addressed to my son. It confirmed the transfer of $47,000 from an account in my name into an account I had never opened. The date was 9 days earlier. The memo line said estate planning. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I would have expected them to shake. I read it again. Then I went to the bedroom and got a piece of paper and wrote down every detail: the bank name, the account number, the confirmation number, the date. I folded the paper and put it inside my copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, which has sat on my nightstand for 40 years and which nobody in that house had ever shown the slightest interest in. Then I went back to the kitchen and set the tablet exactly where it had been. I made the cornbread. When they came home, I served dinner. I asked my son how the work thing had gone. I asked her if she was warm enough, because the heat in the back of the house was uneven, and I'd noticed she ran cold. We sat and ate together, the three of us, and I smiled at the right moments, and nobody in that room except me knew that everything had changed. I lay awake that night for a long time. I thought about Gordon. I thought about how he'd bought that policy when our children were small, how we'd argued about the cost because money was tight, and I thought it was unnecessary. How he'd said, "Seal, if something happens to me, I want to know you'll be okay." I thought about how he'd said that with such certainty, such confidence, that the future was something you could provision against if you were careful enough. I thought about how much I'd loved him for that. I thought about my son, who used to fall asleep in my lap during thunderstorms when he was small, whose first-grade teacher had told me he was one of the most earnest children she'd ever taught. I thought about how much I did not want to believe what that email said about who he had become. But I had been making excuses for a long time. I had been tired of the tension, and I had been lonely, and I had wanted things to be fine, and $47,000 doesn't lie. The next morning, I waited until they both left the house. Then I put on my coat and I drove to the public library, not for nostalgia, though I won't pretend that didn't cross my mind. I went because I knew the computers there were not connected to anything in my home, and because I needed to make a call with some privacy. I had a former colleague whose husband was a retired attorney. We hadn't spoken in over a year, which I now regretted. I used the library phone to call her, and she was, blessedly, exactly the kind of person she'd always been. She gave me his number without asking too many questions. I called him from the parking lot on my old cell phone, the one I'd stopped using when she'd suggested we share a family plan. I'd never actually canceled it, he answered. I told him, quickly and clearly, what I'd found. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Cecily, I need you to do a few things before we talk again." He told me to request my own account statements, all of them, going back 2 years, and have them sent to a P.O. box, not my home address. He told me to write down, from memory, every financial decision I could remember being involved in or pressured about since my son and his wife moved in. Dates, conversations, what was said. He told me not to change my behavior at home. Not yet. I did all of it. What the statements showed was worse than the email. Over 14 months, there had been withdrawals, transfers, and account restructurings, totaling just over $90,000. Some of it was the savings account transfer I'd seen evidence of. Some of it was smaller. Transfers of 2,000 here, 3,500 there. Things that individually might not have triggered alarm, but that together told a very clear story. The account in my name that I'd supposedly agreed to consolidate into had been emptied. The new account it consolidated into, the one I'd signed papers for, was jointly held, and then money had moved from that account to one that was hers alone. The paperwork I'd signed had not been what she described. I sat with my attorney for a long time. He explained things carefully and clearly, the way a good teacher does, and I appreciated that. He said the situation was serious but not irreversible. He said I had options. He said, "You're going to have to make some hard decisions about how you want to proceed." I told him I wanted everything back, and I wanted to make sure it could never happen again. What came next was not fast and it was not easy. I want to say that plainly, because I think these stories sometimes make it sound like, once you decide to fight back, things fall into place neatly. They don't. There were weeks of gathering documentation. There were meetings. There was a morning I had to sit across the table from my son and his wife in a conference room, and I had to look at my son, this person I had carried, nursed, comforted through every hard thing, and watch him look at the table instead of at me. And I thought, I don't know who you became. That was the hardest moment, not the legal parts. Eventually, restitution was agreed upon. The money was returned. Not immediately, not all at once, but it was returned. The paperwork was unwound. My name was cleared from the joint account. I consulted with a different financial advisor, one I found myself, and I restructured everything properly. My accounts now have exactly one name on them, mine. They moved out the month the agreement was finalized. I didn't ask them to leave. They simply understood that whatever arrangement had existed was over. My son called me twice in the weeks afterward. I answered both times. The conversations were short. He did not apologize. I don't know what I would have done if he had. Maybe nothing would have changed. Maybe something would have shifted. I'll never know. I sold the house on Birchfield Lane. I had lived there for 34 years. Gordon and I had brought our babies home to that house. I had planted the garden in the backyard. I knew every creak of the floors, every draft in winter, every way the afternoon light moved through the kitchen. And when I walked through it that last time, empty, I felt grief, real grief. But underneath it, I felt something I can only describe as relief. The house had stopped being mine somewhere in those 18 months. I hadn't let myself admit it until then. Letting it go meant letting that time go with it. I live in a small apartment now in a town about 40 minutes south of Columbus. It's a good building. My neighbor on the left is a retired nurse named, her name doesn't matter. What matters is that she knocks on my door sometimes with extra soup, and I knock on hers with extra bread. And we have coffee on Saturday mornings and talk about books. I have a reading group that meets on the first Wednesday of every month. I volunteer at the elementary school library, which is something I should have started doing years ago, and the children there are wonderful, curious and loud and absolutely certain the world is full of interesting things. I think about Gordon sometimes when I'm in that library. I think he would have liked knowing that's where I landed. I want to say something to you, if you're watching this, because I know some of you have been through something like this or you're afraid you might be. The thing I lost most wasn't the money. The money was returned. The thing I lost was the version of my son I had believed in for 68 years, and I won't pretend I've made complete peace with that, because I haven't. I don't know if I will. But here is what I know. I am still here. I am still myself. I still know the difference between what's real and what someone wants me to believe, and not a single person in that house could ultimately take that from me, though they tried in ways I'm still discovering. Do not put your children on your accounts. I mean that, with every kindness I have. It doesn't matter how much you trust them. It doesn't matter how much you love them. Your financial security belongs to you alone, and you must guard it like it belongs to you, because it does. If something feels wrong in your own home, if you feel like a guest, if you feel managed, if you feel like your instincts keep getting overruled, trust what you're feeling. I waited too long. I wanted to believe I was wrong. I wasn't, and if you need help, ask for it. Call someone. Write things down. Get a P.O. box. Find an attorney. There are people who will help you. I promise you that is true. I have a cornbread recipe I'm quite proud of, if anyone wants it. I make it on Sunday mornings now, just for myself, in a small kitchen that is mine from the baseboards to the ceiling, and I eat it at a table where the silence sounds like peace instead of punishment, and sometimes that is more than enough.